Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to the first session of our our Understanding Climate Finance class, organized by Rujak Center for Urban Studies. We're very glad that you could join us for today. My name is Zaki, and I'll be your moderator for this session. This class is organized by Rujak Center for Urban Studies, and for those who are still not familiar with us, we're think tank to support just and sustainable cities and urban development in Indonesia. Today, we've brought together a diverse group of IGOs, professionals, academics, and students because we believe that your varied perspectives are very essential to building a more just and equitable climate action, not only in Indonesia, but in the world. And for our session, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers over the coming weeks who will share their expertise on various aspects of climate finance, and we hope this class serves as a space for learning, collaboration, and inspiration. We encourage you, the participants, to actively engage, ask questions, and share your own experiences throughout the sessions. Before we dive into the class, a few quick notes. First, we encourage you to use the Q&A box to share your thoughts, comments, and questions throughout the session. Do not hesitate to use the Q&A box even if the speaker is still presenting. Rujak will check it thoroughly, and this will help us to navigate the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And second of all, the session is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with all registered participants afterward, along with all learning materials. Okay, so for today's session, we have two speakers that are going to talk today. And because of that, there also going to be a 10-minute break between each of the session, which is at around 6 p.m. Indonesian time. Lastly, we hope that this session will be very interactive for you and also be very engaging. And feel free to use the reaction emojis to let us know how you're feeling. Okay, so for today's session, we'll be laying out the foundation of the climate finance. And we are very glad that the first speaker is already here between us. So we're very fortunate to have Sophie Webber with us today and to lead this session. Sophie is geography lecturer at the University of Sydney with a very extensive research in climate finance. She co-authored the book Climate Finance, Taking Position on Climate Futures with Gareth Bryant. Honestly, I've read the book and I think it's very eye-opening for me. And I hope today's session with Sophie will do the same with you guys. Okay. Hello, Sophie. Welcome. We are very excited to learn from you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm going to try and share this slide. We should have practiced this first. Does that look good to you?
Yes, all good.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I'm really excited to talk with you about climate finance. My job is to talk to you as a kind of introduction to the idea of climate finance. My argument is that climate finance is one of the indicators of the kind of politics of climate change, and it's an avenue or an area in which the politics of climate change are being fought, and it's or struggles over climate change are being waged. And also that they're one mechanism for pursuing climate justice. And so I think this is an argument that probably is well aligned to many of the activists and advocates and community groups that are joining us this evening, I hope at least. So as Zaki said, my name is Sophie Webber. I'm a geographer and an urban researcher at the University of Sydney. And I'm coming at you today from Sydney, where I work at the University of Sydney, which is, and important to acknowledge that this land is stolen Gadigal land, and this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So Zaki has already plugged my book, and I want to plug it again. It's not the usual kind of academic book. It's actually, most academics haven't read it. It's actually been really taken up by a lot of policymakers and activists in particular. It's open access. You can get it from this link for free as a PDF. And we've spoken to a whole bunch of activists about this work. I've been giving talks all over the world. And the next speaker later is a speaker from Climate Action Network. And I've given talks to them before too. So I'm really hoping that this book is useful for you as well. But for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to give a broad overview of what is climate finance. The second part, which is the biggest part of the talk, I'm going to describe what I think are some of the biggest trends in climate finance and therefore why I think climate finance matters. And then I'm going to conclude a little bit by talking about reframing climate finance away from a debate about climate debt and towards a debate or a kind of political struggle over climate reparations, and why I think this is an important project for us. Okay, so there's no kind of agreed definition of climate finance. Two key definitions. One of them is the IPCC. They're the kind of major science body on climate change. And they describe climate finance in their chapter on investment and finance as those financial resources which are devoted to addressing climate change by all public and private actors from global to local scales, and that this finance should be intended to either reduce net greenhouse gas emissions or enhance resilience to the impacts of current and projected climate change. The UNFCCC, the kind of peak governing body for international climate politics and policy, they have a very similar definition, but that climate finance is local, national, or transnational finance. It can be from public, private, or what they call alternative, or sometimes called innovative financing mechanisms, and that this supports mitigation and adaptation actions to address climate change. So these are kind of broad definitions, but I think they point to a couple of key things that kind of orient us when we're thinking about climate finance. The first one is that climate finance can come from public or private sources, including individuals. And in fact, individuals are a growing source of climate finance around the world, including in Indonesia. So the public sources can be governments, private sources can be businesses and financial actors, but also individuals making increasingly large investments in their own individual or household or family resilience and mitigation actions. The second point then is that climate finance works across a variety of scales. As we just said, it can be invested at the household level, it can be at community level, at the national level, or it can go internationally. Similarly, these definitions both note that climate finance can be for mitigation activities, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or for adaptation activities. So those activities which seek to help people, ecologies, communities, livelihoods, what have you, infrastructure, adapt to the anticipated impacts of climate change. So this might sound like kind of really obvious points, but the reason that I brought these three things up is that they really mark a kind of distinctive change in what climate finance means. So when the first international agreements for climate change were created, climate finance only really referred to money that was going from rich countries to poor countries. It was between government to government, often mediated by multilateral institutions, but it was largely at this kind of nation state scale, and it was traveling internationally. And so this is, I think, a really important change where climate finance is coming from both public governments and private sources, not just going from government to government, that it's being invested at a variety of different scales. And this question about mitigation and adaptation activities is again important, and an important kind of highlight, which we'll come back to later. And so one of the implications of this shift, I think, is that originally climate finance was intended to address the kind of uneven burdens and uneven responsibilities for climate change. That was a kind of transfer of funding from the global north, who caused climate change to happen, continue to contribute to climate change, to the global south, which didn't have much responsibility, but that was going to experience the most of the impacts of climate change. So instead, beginning with the Paris Agreement in 2015 in particular, climate finance has been recognized to come from a huge variety of actors, to go to a variety of different projects or goals, and that it could be return-seeking investment, private investment, rather than just public funding, so public grants. So to go back a little bit to the kind of where has climate finance come from, the first funding mechanisms associated with addressing climate change date back to the 1990s, particularly the first kind of what was called the Rio Earth Summit, where the UNFCCC was first established, and where it also established the Global Environment Facility. In 2001, a whole variety of other financial mechanisms were established at the Marrakesh Conference of the Parties, so the kind of annual conference of the UNFCCC mechanism. At that conference, that COP, they developed the Least Developed Country Fund and the Adaptation Fund. And then most of these funds came into operation in 2007 in the Bali COP. The 2009 Copenhagen COP was another really important event for climate finance. This was the one where the parties to the convention agreed to raise $30 billion in climate finance a year, which was to increase to $100 billion per year by 2020. This was also the COP that established the Green Climate Fund. And by 2015, at the Paris COP, it was determined that the Green Climate Fund would manage this $100 billion a year. They would attract this funding, they would distribute it, and they would program climate action from these finance source. So the thing that to me is important across this timeline to emphasize is that most of the funding in these early stages was from governments to other governments, particularly from what is called Annex 1 or developed countries to Annex 2 or developing countries. And the other thing to note too then is that all of these institutions, the Global Environment Facility, the Least Developed Country Fund, the Green Climate Fund, all of them have a really strong connection to the multilateral development banks and the international financial institutions. So all of the funds I just mentioned are managed by the World Bank. That means they have an oversized role in kind of determining how that funding is governed, how it's deployed. But the World Bank also takes a cut, quite a significant cut from that funding. It's usually 1 to 2% of the funding the World Bank kind of taxes. The Asian Development Bank, other large environmental NGOs, multilateral banks, they also implement a lot of these projects that are funded from this climate finance. At one point, the UNDP was said to be implementing some 80% of Green Climate Fund projects, for example. So the Green Climate Fund, I think, has become a kind of symbol of the failures or discontents of contemporary climate politics around climate finance. So as I've been describing, like other forms of climate finance, the Green Climate Fund was originally established with some core principles of climate justice at its heart. And this was not just about distributing money from rich countries to poor countries, it was also about governance. So there were elements of representational justice where developing countries were going to have the same number of seats on the board of governance of the Green Climate Fund as developed countries, that developing countries would be able to access funding directly from the Green Climate Fund through what has been called accredited entities. So for instance, commercial banks or other entities could apply to be accredited by the Green Climate Fund and then to receive direct funding rather than it having to go snake its way through the UNDP or other organizations. And for instance, in Indonesia, the Indonesian Climate Change Trust Fund is a direct access entity. And it was also intended that the Green Climate Fund would fund adaptation and mitigation activities equally. So those are the original ambitions, but in the last few years, a lot of those goals have been eroded, and many developing countries and climate activists have become very concerned about the projects that the Green Climate Fund is funding, and as well as the shortfall in funding into the Green Climate Fund. So the $100 billion target was not reached by 2020. It was only reached by around 2023. And I think more importantly, a lot of critics or people who've been examining the Green Climate Fund have argued that this figure is really vastly overinflated. It counts loans that must be repaid. So, could it really be counted as climate finance if most of that money is returning to investors, whether they're private investors or public investors? It counts projects that very barely related to climate change, and accounts funding that's not additional to existing official development assistance commitments. And so in what they call their shadow climate finance report, the international NGO Oxfam finds instead of $100 billion being mobilized, only around $20 billion of climate finance is being mobilized through the GCF. There's also a whole bunch of critics which have pointed out failures in the actual projects themselves being implemented, their benefits, and so on. And while there were these commitments to better representation of developing countries on the Green Climate Fund, as I said, the World Bank continues to maintain a lot of control over how it operates. And many small countries have had a lot of difficulty getting access to direct access through the Green Climate Fund. But so one of the things that I want to do in the remainder of my time is to kind of take climate politics beyond the Green Climate Fund. So the Green Climate Fund is certainly really important, but I think it kind of draws our attention away from what we see as other, and we describe in the book as these kind of seismic transformations happening in the financial system itself. So at the same time as the Green Climate Fund was being debated at the Conference of the Parties to the event of the UNFCCC, there were other transformations in finance that were happening at the center of the global financial system. So in these pictures here, we have the former governor of the Bank of England down in the bottom, Mark Carney, and above him we have the CEO of BlackRock, the world's biggest asset manager, so one of the biggest private financial institutions in the world, Larry Fink. And there are these two faces of this kind of increase in sustainable finance. And so Mark Carney describes a new sustainable financial system is currently being built. Or Larry Fink says that we're on the edge of a fundamental reshaping of finance. And they're both here talking about how climate risk has come to play a major role in the decisions of financial markets. And this is happening at the scale of trillions and trillions of dollars rather than just the $100 billion of the Green Climate Fund. So for instance, environmental activist Bill McKibben describes that these kind of announcements from these kind of core private finance individuals caused what he says was a kind of physical tremble in Manhattan as the money shifted from polluting industries into green industries. I think that's probably an exaggeration, but that's what he says. And the other point to make here too is that these announcements from Mark Carney and Larry Fink don't come out of nowhere. Instead, they come on the back of a lot of climate activists, climate justice activists who've really engaged in the financing of dirty assets. And their strategy has really to what they say is stop the money pipeline. So stop money going from BlackRock into fossil fuel assets. And this is part of their follow the money strategy of climate politics, which have really targeted these financial institutions. And so why am I talking about this? Well, I think that this kind of putting together the changes that are happening at the Green Climate Fund, as well as the changes in the financial system, are important to understand together when we're thinking about what is climate finance. And that, for instance, and for me, it's this for three reasons. Firstly, it signals that climate change is shifting global finance that far exceeds these kind of north-south climate finance negotiated through the UNFCCC, such as the Green Climate Fund. So that's the first point. Second, these transformations signal the dominance of a particular kind of climate finance. So that's climate finance that is market-oriented and market control. So climate finance in the image of Larry Fink. And that's important not just for climate finance happening in the global financial system, but increasingly for climate finance in the UNFCCC mechanisms. And finally, then it kind of points out how climate finance is a growing terrain of climate politics, but where political contestation occurs on the terrain of the finance sector itself. And so I think to understand these broad dynamics and encompassing dynamics, we need to understand climate finance beyond the Green Climate Fund as something that spans the terrain of international climate politics, but also climate-induced transformations in public finance, financial statecraft, and financial markets. And so to do this in the book, this is a little bit of book talk. It hasn't really been so far, but we define climate finance as strategies that mobilize financial ideas, instruments, and institutions to reshape the relationship between capitalist economies and climate change. And this is important because we're particularly interested in how not only is climate change, not only is the finance sector kind of, not only is, or how do I say this? Not only is finance being positioned as the solution to climate change, but increasingly climate change is changing the financial structures and logics of contemporary capitalism. And we're interested in the opportunities that might create for more progressive and more just climate finance outcomes, particularly for urban activists and climate activists. So I'm going to skip over that. Okay, so we're up to part 2 then, the major trends in climate finance. So there's a lot of debates in climate politics about how to count climate finance, and I'm going to skip over all of that and talk a little bit about one of the major reports, which is this one by the Climate Policy Institute. So they're a San Francisco-based think tank. They do great work tracing climate finance in these magnificent graphs that you can see on this scheme. They have an Indonesian office. So they only have a couple of offices around the world. They do have an Indonesian office. And in fact, you'll hear from the director of CPI in Indonesia in a couple of weeks' time. So this is a great resource for anyone that's interested in the kind of major trends in climate finance in Indonesia and beyond Indonesia. So each year they release this global landscape of climate finance book, which this graph comes from. So this is the central figure for 2024's global landscape book. And the headline here is that climate finance reached $1.3 trillion each year across 21 and 22. So they find that climate finance more than doubled between 2018 and 2022. Nonetheless, they report a needed 5-fold increase, so from 1.5 trillion to $7.4 trillion per year by 2030 to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming and to provide funding to support adaptation activities. So the headline here is climate finance is growing. There's a lot of money. 1.5 trillion is kind of too big for us to imagine, I think. But that this needs to increase by 5-fold in order to stay within 1.5 degrees. The other headline from this graph is that, so the blue funding is public funding, the orange funding is private funding. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is that should just clarify, this public funding doesn't all mean it's like free money. This is return seeking public funding. that mitigation is the overwhelming destination for almost all of this climate finance. So 1.3 trillion of 1.5 trillion in 2022 was to mitigation activities. And the geographies of this investment are also really important, and I'll touch on this in a little bit. Most of this climate finance was towards mitigation activities, mostly in advanced economies and in China. So only 12% of mitigation finance went to emerging and developing economy countries, including countries like Indonesia, and only 1% went to least developed countries. So I'm going to go through a few of these trends. In the interest of time, I'm going to try and skip through it quite quickly. So this graph is focused on adaptation, which is my area of expertise. So I'm always interested to highlight this because sometimes I think it doesn't get enough attention. So adaptation finance doubled between 2018 and 2020. But as you can see here, again, a really large increase is needed to meet adaptation needs. And the CPI thinks this is a vast understatement because it's very difficult to estimate how much adaptation is going to cost, particularly as we don't invest enough in mitigation and the costs of adaptation kind of spiral. Yeah, so as I said before, one of the points to raise here is that they do find quite a large portion of this adaptation funding, actually, like more than half, is household financial products. So households investing in financial products to increase their own resilience. So this is a regional image. This is just in emerging markets and developing economies, which is the category they use. And once you exclude, so China, for emerging markets and developing economies, China is almost 70% of all climate finance. Okay, so a huge proportion of climate finance is going towards China. Sorry. Once you break that down to other emerging markets and developing economies, you can see that there is a really uneven geography here of where this finance is going. So no region is on track to meet their climate finance needs, but still this landscape is highly uneven. The 45 poorest, least developed countries, also the most vulnerable countries, received less than 5% of the total climate finance just for developing countries. So less than 5% of this went to least developed countries. And once China is accounted for in these emerging markets and developing economies, growth has been quite sluggish in terms of climate finance increases. And as in climate finance more generally, mitigation really dominates the climate finance activities to these groups of countries, and mostly this is investment in energy systems. So the other point to note too, my notes here are a little bit in the wrong order, I think, but that a lot of this adaptation finance is provided as debt instruments. So up to 85% of adaptation finance is in developing countries is being provided as debt. So that means that projects or countries or communities who are receiving this climate finance have to repay it, even when they use that money to increase their adaptive capacity. I'll talk about this more. This is kind of my major point about climate finance. But the kind of big picture here is that despite a growth in international support for climate finance, that share of public climate finance fell considerably. So for grants fell considerably. And I think this is a real problem. Okay, so if my argument is that we need to think not just about the Green Climate Fund, but also about private climate finance, then this is where we're going to do it. So the unevenness in green financial tools is evident in the green bond market, which I'm going to talk about now, as well as renewable energy investment, which I'll talk about next. So Indonesia, as you would all know, has issued a number of green bonds, blue bonds, sustainability bonds, green and sukuk instruments as well on both domestic and international financial markets. So I think these are a kind of paradigmatic tool of what we call climate capital. So climate finance instruments that seek to use climate change or responding to climate change as an opportunity for capitalist growth, and through which private financial actors like banks and asset managers pursue profitable investment opportunities. And green bonds are the kind of most significant part of this broader family of differently colored debt instruments. A green bond operates very similar to what is called a vanilla bond. So how this works is that a borrower, for instance, the Indonesian government, issues a bond. They sell it to an investor who then loans money to the issuer in return for regular interest payments, as well as the repayment of what is called the bond principal, so the amount of the original loan, the amount of the original bond at maturity, which is the end of the contract. So green bonds are structured in exactly the same way, except that they also have what's called a kind of green conditionality, or has environmental or climate credentials. And in this figure, which is from the Climate Bonds Initiative, which has very similar cool graphs as the Climate Policy Institute, they describe, or they find, a really uneven geography of access to green bonds. As with climate finance more broadly, green bonds are really concentrated in Europe and in North America. Less than 10% of the green bond market is in Asia, excluding China. There's a really rapidly growing green bond market in China. And so this means that much of the least developed countries, much of the global south, is completely locked out of the green bond market. Partly this is inherent to these tools as themselves. They have a kind of minimum size, which is around $200 million, which is not often a possibility in many, for instance, small island developing states. Much of the existing research about green bonds also shows that those who are issuing green bonds do not currently have difficulty accessing other forms of capital. So green bonds aren't really providing additional finance. So if the government of Indonesia, for instance, wasn't going to issue a green bond, it could easily raise capital somewhere else. So it's not really providing additional finance. And finally, green bonds often kind of unequally distribute risk between investors and the publics that are ultimately paying for those investments. So over and again, green bonds are often being repaid through increased taxes and user services, which are paid for by consumers. So there's this kind of regressive taxation inherent to green bonds. It's not really a rosy picture in renewable energy asset finance either. So in quantitative terms, climate finance is dominated by private sector investment in renewable energy assets. And there's a really growing and vibrant body of research which has examined what happens when these big, what are called utility scale renewable energy installations kind of hit the ground in a variety of different contexts. So this picture here is from a solar farm in Karnataka in southern India, where my colleague and co-author Gareth Bryant has done a lot of research. So this is a massive solar park. At the time it was built, it was amongst the biggest in the world, although that was in around 2001, and there's subsequently been much bigger ones. It's run by 8 Indian and multinational corporations, and the government played a key role in kind of securing this project. They provided long-term contracts for the energy that they bought the energy that this solar park produces, and they also entered into 28-year leases with local landholders and provided the land, to the renewable energy companies. The kind of those who lucked out from this deal, though, are the local landless laborers who lost their livelihoods as agricultural laborers on the land, which is now a solar park that you can see in the photo. And they've not benefited from any of the leasing income, unlike the land owners themselves. So the benefits of what we call renewable energy assets, investment in renewable energy assets, tend to be narrowly shared by the asset holders and parties to its associated contracts, rather than there being a kind of large scale or wide scale community economic development benefit. And then finally, I've hinted at this a little bit, but one of the biggest trends in climate finance is towards various kinds of debt instruments. And so this figure is from the Oxfam Climate Finance Shadow Report. And here they're kind of reporting on the $100 billion in the Green Climate Fund. So they find that almost 70% of this funding is public finance. That's what these blue and purple dots are. But of that $70 billion, a large chunk, almost 30 billion, is in non-concessional loans. Okay, so there is no concessional element to the loans that have been given to projects or companies or have you to as climate finance. A very small proportion of it is grants, and some of it is concessional loans. So where the money is a little bit cheaper than you might otherwise access. So they argue in this report that there have been an excessive, and this is a quote from the report, there's an excessive number of loans, insufficient grants, inadequate funding for adaptation, and misleading accounting practices that mean climate finance is far from fulfilling its purpose. Only a small share of climate finance has gender equality as a principal objective, and only a small share is for locally led action. Even worse, in some cases, climate finance should be helping communities thrive despite climate change. It's likely harming them in a variety of other ways. And so this is an example of what climate activists that I've worked with call the kind of false solutions of climate finance, where climate finance is promised, but how it is delivered, the kind of financial mechanisms through which it is delivered, often undermines its own objectives and its broader social and ecological goals. And I think one of the biggest problems is that the shortcomings in climate finance have been responded to by a variety of international actors through what, again, we see as false solutions. So one example of this is what have been called climate debt swaps or debt for climate swaps, debt for nature swaps. These are so for instance, in the climate policy reports that I was talking about, they go through a whole thing about how climate finance is really falling short, and their solution is more innovative finance mechanisms like climate debt swaps. And so these are a common catchphrase for people who have proposed innovative financial responses for vulnerable countries. So the situation is this: many of the poorest and most vulnerable countries in the world are also currently experiencing significant sovereign debt distress. Imagine this situation. This country borrowed a lot of money during COVID to cover shortfalls, for instance, because they no longer had a tourist economy, as well as to issue or to provide a bigger social safety net in terms of social services, medical services, and so on. So they borrowed a lot during COVID. And then following COVID, commodity markets spiked, including for fuel. And interest rates increased, which then made it increasingly difficult for these governments to repay or to service those debts. So many of these countries experienced many of these countries also experienced significant disasters in the last 5 or so years, which crippled their economies and created big rebuilding costs. So 58 of the developing countries most vulnerable to climate change have almost $500 billion of debt servicing repayments. So not actual debts, but debt servicing, so just paying the interest, due in the next few years. And many of these countries are hoping to deal with this problem through climate debt swaps. And the way these swaps work is they're an agreement between sovereigns, for instance, Indonesia, although Indonesia is not really in this situation, and the owners of their debt, the creditors, and to reallocate a portion of the debt that they owe towards investment in climate action. And so the goal is to increase fiscal stability while also increasing climate resilience. And this tool from the Seychelles government is one example of this. It's a kind of original example. And in this example, as it says in this figure, the government of the Seychelles had $21.6 million of debt with the Paris Club. And with the big environmental NGO, the Nature Conservancy, they restructured this debt through a $15 million loan from the Nature Conservancy, from TNC, and a $5 million philanthropic grant. So the actual debt was from 21.6 to 20.2 million. So there was like $1.4 million in debt relief. And then there was a philanthropic grant, and the philanthropic grant was invested in climate action. So So the actual debt relief offered here is extremely limited. Most often what is offered is a very small amount of debt relief and maybe a change in, for instance, the interest rate or the length of the loan. So that's most commonly what is renegotiated. It took 4 years for this deal to be negotiated. And again, the overall debt burden was not significantly reduced. So extremely high transaction costs for very little action on debt or climate finance. Another example of what I would call a false solution is the Bridgetown Initiative. So the Bridgetown Initiative is a broad demand to reframe the international financial architecture. So the World Bank and the IMF for the most part. And led by Mia Mottley, who is an extraordinary Prime Minister of Barbados, she's trying to change the rules of the game of the organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. So the proposals of the Bridgetown Initiative, it's really complicated. I spent a lot of time today trying to understand what the IMF special drawing rights are, and I still don't really understand it. So I'm going to skip over this a little bit. But Mia Mottley had really expansive and really, I think, progressive and just proposals. And as this initiative has kind of worn through various institutions, it's really been pared back in terms of its agenda. But basically, she's trying to argue that there needs to be great increases in access to finance. And the way to do that is to create a whole bunch of concessions for developing countries in this financial architecture. So it's not really about mobilizing more public funding for adaptation and mitigation. It's really about increasing liquidity for developing countries by, as she says, changing the rules of the game. And some of this includes, for instance, changing how the IMF and the World Bank assess debt distress. So labeling fewer countries as in debt distress, which has impacts for their credit ratings. Expanding the balance sheets of IFIs so they can loan more to developing countries. Creating more disaster relief following in terms of debt. So for instance, when a country experiences a really large disaster, changing, for instance, having a debt repayment pause so they won't have to pay interest for a year or two after a disaster. So again, I would say these are all positive steps to making the international financial system more fair for developing countries, but I don't think they would really lead to a fundamental change in the climate financial architecture. Okay, but so instead, I think that there is something to be said about thinking a little bit and working a little bit more seriously on climate debts and climate reparations. So I've talked a lot about how climate finance is increasingly provided as debt. And this makes sense because climate finance operates within and through the financial structures of contemporary capitalism, and debt is the kind of major relationship of contemporary capitalism. So as I said, this includes the increasing use of non-concessional and concessional debt instead of grant mechanisms, and I would say that the kind of increasing prevalence of loans instead of grants is really eroding the publicness and the justice elements of climate finance. Another element of climate debt, of course, is the increasing prevalence of these innovative and exotic debt instruments such as green bonds or debt for nature or debt for climate swaps. And one of the reasons I've presented this fairly gloomy outlook, I think, is that these trends towards sovereign debts and innovative financial instruments entrench unequal relations. So through everything, as I've described, from a lack of access to green bond markets in small island states, higher interest rates paid by vulnerable countries, or the relatively high transaction costs of these exotic debt instruments. And these unequal financial relationships are made even more unfair under climate change and its increasing costs for these vulnerable countries. At the same time, I think, though, that the argument of climate change as a kind of debt relation does open up new and interesting kinds of points for political contestation for climate movements and governments to challenge conventional debt relationships. So the idea of climate debt kind of draws on the idea of an ecological debt that the global north has accrued to the global south. So it references the inherent inequalities in the benefits of fossil fuel production and consumption and the impacts that this has on climate change. It also recognizes that responding to climate change has monetary costs that the global south is having to bear. So the argument from activists here is that the global north has accrued a climate debt to the global south. And while there are some kind of boring accounting questions, I would argue that these kind of debates about how you might calculate a climate debt, how you assign who is a creditor and who is a debtor, and what a fair share of historic and contemporary emissions could be calculated. And so this is what Jason Hickel is doing in this image here. And there's been a bit of a debate amongst the scientists about this. So I think those are politically capacious debates. But overall, I think that this argument about climate debts raises a kind of moral argument that if the IMF and the World Bank insist that governments have to repay their sovereign debts despite them being accrued during catastrophic climate events, then also shouldn't they be repaying their climate debt from the global south to the global north? And so I think then this argument about climate debts it starts to take steps towards what activists have called climate reparations. And this was particularly forcefully argued after the catastrophic floods in Pakistan a few years ago. Like many other vulnerable countries, Pakistan was facing growing debt servicing commitments and had a constrained fiscal capacity to respond to the multi-billion dollar catastrophe. At the time, Pakistan's climate change minister argued that rather than being provided with disaster relief or climate finance, the country was owed climate reparations. And they argued that these reparations must finally address the root causes of climate change, a legacy of colonialism and its justification to exploit, plunder, and create the climate catastrophe we see. And so this was one argument for climate reparations, and there have been many others. But I think the important thing is that they recognize how wealthy countries have caused climate change and that those feeling its impacts were the least to contribute to climate change, but also that this builds on and is integrated within and emerges from a long list of historical wrongs whose impacts and practices continue today. This includes colonial plunder, dispossession, and enslavement that has enriched the global north at the expense of the global south, and particularly at the expense of indigenous peoples. And so Olufemi Otewo has written really forcefully about what climate reparations might pursue. And he argues that debt cancellation and debt justice are just the first steps towards reparations, which could include a package of finance that starts to compensate countries for the incalculable social, economic, and environmental harms that rich countries have caused around the world, while offering fiscal space and resources to build a safer and more prosperous future. So visions for modest debt restructuring and climate debt swaps, other false solutions of climate finance, fail to invert these debtor and creditor relations. So they don't recognize the climate debts that are owed from the global north to the global south. Climate debt justice towards comprehensive debt forgiveness begins this program of what activists have called world-making climate reparations. Okay. I will leave it there. Thank you so much for your patience. I know that was a lot of talking at you. So yeah, I'm now open for questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Sophie, for your very insightful presentation. Okay, so we now have some time to have some questions. I think we already got some question. Can you read some in your chat from Emily?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you want to bank the question or just answer it directly?
I can answer that question directly.
Okay.
Okay. So if climate finance is given to the global south in the form of loans, this does not help developing countries to cope with the impacts of climate change. Okay, Rich, how do the parties see this issue? So, one of the I guess the growing common sense in climate finance, but also in finance for the SDGs, for economic development, for anti-poverty measures, is a kind of austerity mindset. And so the idea is that there's not enough public funding to go around. I'm sure many of you will have heard this idea before. There's not enough public funding to go around. And so public funding should be used instead to leverage private investment into a variety of other to increase the total pie. So if public funding could be used to decrease the risk of private investment into a whole variety of different climate projects, then we might be able to increase the total money that is mobilized towards climate finance. So it's just a matter of austerity that there, as you say, that climate finance being mobilized as loans doesn't often help the country receiving those loans, although I will precursor that in a minute. But there is a real a kind of common sense that there isn't enough public funding to go around, and that therefore we need private funding to fill the gap. I think that I think that we should resist recognizing that there isn't enough public funding. For instance, the climate policy reports emphasize that climate finance currently is equal to fossil fuel subsidies. So the idea that there isn't enough money when fossil fuel extraction is being subsidized to the same tune as climate finance, clearly then that's not true. There is plenty more money out there subsidizing fossil fuels. There are some projects, of course, where private investment does make a lot of sense. Renewable energy projects do generate income streams, and so maybe it does make sense for private actors to invest in that. My colleague and friend Brett Christophers has just released a book about private investment in renewable energy, and he argues that renewable energy installations, new renewable energy assets don't generate enough income for private investors, and so states still need to subsidize them. That's probably true, but still, I think there is a role for, or in our current kind of, in the way that capitalism is currently organized, there is a role for private sector investment. The benefits will still flow to those investors rather than to community, into community economic development. So I think that's a good, a very broad or a very deep, long answer to that question. Climate reparations. So how does climate reparations differ from the climate responsibilities from the Kyoto Protocol? So many of the responsibilities of the kind of justice principles that are embedded in the Kyoto Protocol continue to be relevant in the international mechanisms, in the international agreements. There still is a commitment to common but differentiated responsibilities. There still is a division of countries where rich countries are seen to take on more role than poor countries. So those climate responsibilities remain relevant. They have not gone away. It's just a matter of what then that means for the kind of climate action. I think the main difference to climate reparations from climate responsibilities is in a couple of ways. Firstly, climate reparations are backwards looking and forwards looking. So they are both historical and future. So that's one difference. The second difference is, however, that it understands climate change in relation to other forms of extraction and exploitation. So it's not to kind of separate climate change out from colonialism and various other forms of exploitation. And so I think that is a really major difference between how the international policy mechanisms like the Kyoto Protocol thinks about climate responsibilities. So does each country adapt climate finance differently based on their key sectors or national priorities for a country whose main income comes from oil and gas? I'm not sure. That question just disappeared. Sorry. I'm not sure exactly about that, but it really depends what the climate finance is, the role that the government plays. Like all development finance, I know a lot about the relationship between Australia and Indonesia, and that is always a negotiation between the interests of Australia and the interests of Indonesia. And that the different power relations play a role for sure, but both of those countries kind of come together to talk about how they might share climate finance. A country whose main income comes from oil and gas is going to think about climate finance differently for sure. But that's like any financial arrangement, I think. So yes, there is a difference in how countries are thinking about climate finance and how they implement projects based on that. So why is the Seychelles debt swap a false solution despite the provision of debt relief and grants? So I think we would suggest that the amount of debt relief was very minor. If we go from 21.6 or something to $20.2 million, that is a really tiny amount of debt relief that an entire public bureaucracy negotiated. It took 4 years. To me, that seems like a giant waste of resources and not really a whole lot of debt relief. So that's one reason why. The other thing I think is a lot of these tools are being proposed and they're getting what has been called climate conditionalities put on them. So there's a lot of this being discussed in South Africa at the moment. This is not only does it sound like structural adjustment, it actually looks like structural adjustment. That's exactly what they're trying to achieve through these debt relief mechanisms. So through those kinds of negotiations, I would argue that the governments have a lot less power to determine how they devote their fiscal resources. It's kind of eroding sovereignty over that funding. So that's another problem. The main thing I think is that these are really complex deals. They're often very, very small. They don't really have the potential to scale to meet the kind of climate finance needs that are being laid out by that figure from climate policy, is there by CPI, for instance. So that's one reason it's a false solution. And the other reason too is that it's not really addressing the root causes of the problem. And so that's why activists have talked about this as a kind of false solution to the needs of climate finance. Okay, so in terms of access to climate funds, which aspects the institutions use to choose the countries to get the fund? Many developing countries hard to get access. So there's a lot of reasons why countries have difficulty accessing the Green Climate Fund, and that looks different in a wide variety of cases. So that'll be very different for Indonesia compared to the small island developing states where I work. It's a bureaucratic process. It's like getting funding from the World Bank. In fact, it's the same as getting funding from the World Bank. It's not free money. There's a lot of So one of the problems with being in the World Bank is that you're subject to their procurement rules, to their hiring rules, to all of those things like that. So it's a big bureaucratic institution. It's very difficult for countries. So I've done work in Kiribati. There's like 100,000 people who live in this tiny, small island state, and they have to do the same kind of procurement things to get access to this funding as Indonesia does as a country of several hundred million people. So there's an intensely bureaucratic process which makes it very difficult for countries to get access. In terms of the direct access mechanisms, so the Indonesian Climate Change Trust Fund is one example. They're a direct access entity. There's also the designated authority to the GCF, which exists within the Ministry of Finance. So they engage directly with the GCF as well. That's, again, a bureaucratic process. It requires a lot of assessment of their financial capacity, of their annual reports and all sorts of things like that. So those, obviously, again, very small countries who are intensely vulnerable and need access to funding don't have a lot of financial institutions who might be able to get to satisfy the requirements of this big international financial organization. I don't think that the problem here is I'm not suggesting there's any kind of corruption. I don't think that that's the case. I think these are just bureaucratic processes which take a lot of time and that don't necessarily reward developing and vulnerable countries, which might have exceptional circumstances, which mean it's difficult for them to meet those bureaucratic requirements. All right. All finance is climate finance. I didn't talk on about that very much, but I have a lot of arguments with my co-author about whether mortgages for building houses also should be considered climate finance. But we did have to narrow down the focus a little bit. So the Global Alliance for Incinerator, a global network of grassroots on waste, climate, and justice, how to shift climate finance for what we call zero waste solutions. Is an essential public service that don't most yeah. Uh, okay. All right. So I am definitely not an expert on waste, although I did just read the CPI report and it did talk about waste and about how waste was a huge area for new investment in climate finance. So I will acknowledge that you should read the climate policy report and tell me about how waste management might be considered part of climate finance solutions. I mean, where I live, waste is a privately provided service. So there are situations in which waste management as an essential public service, I agree with you about that, is able to be income generating. It's profitable for investors all around the world. Big international water management and waste management companies make a lot of money from that all over the world. So it's not to say that it's not profitable. I do think it should be an essential public service. And I think that you can play different kind of strategic politics about this. So on the one hand, you could recognize that or maintain that waste has to remain an essential public service while also trying to understand what kinds of climate finance arrangements might be beneficial to your group, while also recognizing that most of those private finance arrangements do not have waste and the kind of justice elements of waste at their heart. So a lot of them are, there's a lot of examples from green bonds, for instance, which have invested in, or not a lot, there's a couple of examples from green bonds that have invested in what we might think of as essential public services. And when they have done, they've increased user fees, they've increased taxes, local government taxes, for instance, to pay for that public service. So entering into those financial arrangements has really eroded the kind of publicness at the heart of those services. Okay, so yeah, I'm not sure that I have specific advice, but how much can concessional loans help us? So I think I talked about that before with renewable energy. I think if we're satisfied with contemporary capitalism status quo, then concessional loans can be very useful for some assets. So not all climate outcomes can be assetized, and that's particularly true of adaptation. And so loans don't help when your project that you invest in or your infrastructure or what have you doesn't generate income, then loans are not gonna help. I don't know much about ITMOs, carbon markets. I have not been, I can't say much about that. And I think up next, there'll be an update which might be helpful. So there's still tons and tons of questions here, and I note that we're past time. So what would you like to do, Rujak folks?
Hi. Thank you,
Hi.
Sophie,
I could
for
keep
your
talking for
answers.
a whole other hour,
No,
but
no.
I don't
I
think
think
that's what anybody wants.
thank you very much for the amazing enthusiasm from the participants. I think unfortunately the time difference between us here in Jakarta and Sophie also is a problem, and I think we could just wrap up your session if that's okay. And if your questions is still unanswered, maybe we can redirect it to the next session as we approach to the next session. So once again, thank you very much, Sophie, for the insightful presentation. So right now we are going to have a short 10-minute break. So after this, we're going to hear some presentation from Nakul Sharma, a program coordinator from Coalition, CANSA. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much, Sophie. We'll see you next time. Hello, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoy your break. It is a short break that I hope you can refresh a bit. So, right now we have another opportunity to delve deeper into some insight of climate finance, especially on the event that took place not long ago, actually. So, it's a conference of parties, COP, COP29 in Baku last year. And the specific topics of this COP is about climate finance. And today we are going to have a session with someone who's also part of the COP, and and he will tell us some updates from COP and what it means to us as the civil society in driving climate justice and climate finance. So here we are right now with Nakul Sharma. So Nakul is from Climate Action Network South Asia, or CANSA, a coalition of about 250 civil society organizations working in 8 South Asian countries. Is that right, Nakul?
Yeah.
And this CANSA is have the goal to limit actions across sectors to limit human-induced climate change. And so I will give the screen to you, Nakul. Over to you.
Thank you, Zaki. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and warm regards to all the participants and Rujak Urban Center for Urban Studies for giving Climate Action Network South Asia and me in particular this opportunity to discuss and present the key takeaways from COP29 and also link a bit on the key takeaways, not only from a COP's perspective, but also from the perspective of urbanization, climate change, and how inclusive urbanization could be made priority in global south, so to say. So thank you once again, Zaki, for I'll just take a while. I'll start sharing my screen, and thank you once again for giving and setting the context and um, giving a brief introduction of Climate Action Network South Asia. If you can just give me a nod or a thumbs up if you can see my slides. I'll also start with a brief introduction of Climate Action Network South Asia, and then I'll come to the overall overview of the presentation, today's presentation. So just to start with, and just to give you a the 360-degree overview of what we do at CAN South Asia is, as Zaki said, that we are a network of civil society organization working in 8 South Asian countries. We not only do the advocacy work which is related to on ground implementation work which involves, of course, as you can see on the slide, the advocacy piece is central piece of our work, which involves working with various not only civil society organizations but with various government organizations. And these government organizations are both local government organizations, national level government organizations, and regional work as well. How we can foster regional collaboration between various regional countries, between Bangladesh and Nepal, between Nepal and India, India and Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth. Need not to highlight the fact that, of course, the central pillar of our work and the advocacy work that we do at CAN South Asia revolves around the lens of climate change, and that's where not only advocacy but also our actions. As I said, that we also do a quite a bit of stuff with grassroots organizations, which also involves coming up with the district climate resilience districts. I mean, since the audience for this webinar would be from various regions across the globe, so when I say district, district is the shortest or the minutest form of governance in South Asian continent. So district is a geographical governance nomenclature which we use to donate that that's where the governance happens. So we do action, we do advocacy, and we do networking. Of course, we are a network of 250 plus organizations at Climate Action Network South Asia. But not taking too much time to explain our role, I can quickly come on to the real expectation from today's presentation. And as you can see from the slide, I think Zaki has kindly mentioned that I'm supposed to share the experience from COP29, and I had been thinking hard that this session is around for 40-45 minutes. So what is it that I could present, especially to build your perspective on climate negotiations, international perspective, and then come to COP29 negotiations, which has not really ended on a positive note, and then what are the opportunities and challenges that we as civil society organization foresee in short to medium term to come up with a robust action plan, so to say, to follow up with not only the international momentum related to climate finance, but also the urbanization and city-led actions. So we'll start, with basic information about Paris Climate Accord, a reintroduction, I think refresher. Most of you would know it. The process of implementation of Paris Agreement, basically the timelines, key outcomes. A refresher is required when we are going to understand what was expected from COP29 and what it delivered. It also needed a refresher on COP28, which happened last year, 2023 in Dubai. Where does the demand from climate finance came from? Expectation from COP29, certainly that's I'm going to cover, and what was delivered. And where does the overall narration on urbanization, city level climate action stands today in climate negotiations, and the potential role that we foresee for civil society. So I hope that's okay, and I'll just move forward with brief of, this is just a scene setting slide, as you can see on your screens, that this is a chart which very clearly shows and denotes, where does the climate conversation comes from. It basically emanates from the overall contribution, the carbon space which has been captured by various countries, so to say. And as you can see, the largest chunk is United States, which has emitted, and these emissions are not actual, not foolproof emissions. These are emissions from 1771 to 2017, and it largely encapsulates emissions from fossil fuel burning and cement and major industrial uses. So as you can see, even these two major sectors, the largest emitters is United States, followed by EU, which is again a chunk of 27 countries, so to say, Canada, Mexico, Russia, all the major historical polluters, emerging economies such as China, India, South Korea, Saudi, Indonesia, Saudi, of course, the petrostates, Kazakhstan, Iran, and there are other prominent emerging economies like South Africa, Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia are also there. But most of the global South, apart from the developed countries and from emerging economies, the largely the set of G20 countries, most of the global southern countries does not factor or show very visibly on this chart. So this really tells you where is the problem and who are the real polluters. So to deal with this problem, I can go back from 2009 onwards, because we are also going to touch upon the issue of climate finance. But I think this is to set the stage. It is important to understand that the rule book for climate change and climate implementation and climate negotiations has been fast forwarded in 2015 with the agreement in Paris, which is largely and most commonly known as the Paris Agreement, and it was the COP21. It was the 21st edition of a Conference of Parties, which is climate change negotiations. And basically the objective of the Paris Agreement was to keep the warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, and to make all dire efforts to keep it within the range of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this was agreed. This was At that point of time in 2015, this was attributed as the watershed moment in climate change negotiations in 2015. What it really, meant in terms of, the finer details was that it has some various, crucial elements related to how, transparency, how implementation, how quantification will be done. And these are some of the key elements just to set the tone right. Is that first is, as I mentioned, 2 degrees and make all aggressive efforts to keep it 1.5. Finance a goal was also set up between for Paris Agreement 2020, and you can see 2020 to 2025. This finance goal was 100 billion goal delivered from global northern countries, the developed countries, which also includes US, Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, and the historical contributors to the global southern countries, the recipient countries. The third important aspect of Paris Agreement was differentiation, which we commonly also call as CBDR. You might have heard the term. CBDR-RC, common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, which basically means is that this is a common cause. Everybody is going to, come up with their own contribution to tackle the mess of climate change. But then the contribution has to be differentiated based on their respective capabilities, because I think not every country, not every individual also has same level of finances, same level of capabilities. Emission objectives was to the fourth pillar was emission objectives by 2050 was aimed at reducing the GHG emissions as soon as possible and as much as possible by various means, by mitigation, by installing more renewable energy, by putting more investment into energy efficiency initiatives, and also by some innovative means such as carbon sinks, promoting carbon sinks, which basically means afforestation and planting more trees. Burden sharing was another clause, the fifth clause, and that is also very important, which said that the developed countries must provide the financial support. The finance goal and the burden sharing goal speaks to each other in the Paris Agreement, which said that not only the finance but also the transfer of critical technologies must take place between global north, the developed countries, and developing countries. A review mechanism, sixth, not last, but second last, very important, was also set up. And this is where we'll also come up to revise the COP28, which was delivered in Dubai, was to have a global stock take, is to prepare a report card. And this had to start in 2023. So we'll touch upon that, is to take a stock take of what has happened, what was committed, how it has fared, and where we are now, what are the improvements that we need to do. And last but not the least, all these 6 or 7 objectives, come up solidly as Paris Agreement. This slide is just to give you a reference of what I mentioned at the start of the session, is that we are here right now in 2025 as per the slides, and you can also see that countries should submitted new NDCs in with 2035 horizon. I'll take you back a couple of years back. So in I'm sorry, there's some mistake on the slide. In 2025, we are going to have COP30. It's COP30. It's not COP31. It's COP30. In 2024, we had COP29. And in 2023, we had COP28. So there's a minor correction. This is a typo error that has happened on this slide. But nonetheless, just to make you understand this would be very important. In 2023 in Dubai, we had the global stocktake that I just mentioned. It was the COP which prepared the report card of where we are. It also came up with some real, tangible outcomes, which we are also going to, mention, which is related to fossil fuel phase out. And last year we had COP29 in Baku in Azerbaijan, which was largely termed at Finance COP. We are in 2025, which is the implementation COP. How finance, how report card is prepared in 2023, finance is delivered, less or more finance that is subjective, interpretation based on global north and global south. But right now in 2025, we are in a period where NDCs, the new third NDCs, are going to be prepared. So just for understanding, this is where we are in terms of timelines of implementation of Paris Agreement. We've just covered it. I'll skip this slide for the moment. So what was really delivered? I'll just come to the real, textual part of what was really delivered in the last two COPs. So I'll start from 2023 onwards, which is COP 28, and then I'll come to 2024, which was COP 29. So 4 or 5 major outcomes. You would have seen so many coverage in print media, so many things, and so many headlines had been coming out in the last 2 years of how climate change has been manifesting itself, how there are various impacts. So what international community has been doing is to first this language is really important, and it promotes confidence in climate negotiators. Is that in 2023 the Dubai COP was the first COP to, as you can see in paragraph 2, was the first COP out of 28 editions to accept and acknowledge the role of fossil fuel. And it mentioned that the necessity of moving away or transitioning away from fossil fuel is prominent. And while doing and reducing the dependence on fossil fuel, it is also important to enhance the role of renewable energy, which is tripling the role of renewable energy and doubling the energy efficiency. And these were very positive outcomes from COP28 in 2023. Apart from the outcomes on transition away from fossil fuel, the COP28 presidency in Dubai also mentioned and gave some guiding figures on what are the financial means which were required to transition away from fossil fuel and make new investment into renewable energy, in low carbon infrastructure, in energy efficiency, in climate smart buildings, in green roads, and so many things. So they gave a ballpark figure of 5.8 to 5.9 trillion for a pre-2030 NDC target. And this figure, 5.8 to 5.9 trillion, was for all emerging economies, all emerging and all developing world, excluding China. Of course, China can also cater its own domestic requirements. It has a lot of financial cult now. And this figure was also very well taken up by civil society organizations. Last but not the least, the COP28 also delivered two things. First, it operationalized the Loss and Damage Fund Board that was agreed in COP27 in Egypt. And second, it also mentioned that it also come up with very strong language on the global stock take, which is the report card. It said that the world collectively is not doing enough, and we are way beyond our ambitious target under Paris Agreement to meet the 1.5-degree goal. With the current set of NDCs submissions, we are definitely going to touch 2.4-degree world in the next 7 to 8 years. By the way, we have already breached the 1.5-degree target. I'm going to come to that slide later. So just a brief summary of COP28. I hope I'm able to convey where the expectations were set for COP29 especially on climate finance in Baku. So just before coming to Baku, I hope you would know this, but just to set the context, what is climate finance and where is it that I am coming from, is that, as I said, I can set the tone back in 2009, is that in COP15, which is also much before the Paris Agreement, in Copenhagen, a decision was taken that there is a need to mobilize money and resources from global north, from developed countries, because developed countries are the countries which have historical responsibility, and they need to pay up for the excessive emission of carbon dioxide into atmosphere. And that's where and it was in lieu of more ambitious targets by developing countries. So as I said, in 2009, a political figure of 100 billion was put on the table. It wasn't agreed in 2000 until the Paris Agreement in 2015, but nonetheless, a ballpark figure of 100 billion was sort of first time introduced in 2009. Fast forward to Paris Agreement. This figure was agreed in Paris Agreement, and that's where we take our experience from the 100 billion goal. What has happened on the last climate finance agreement in the last so many years, as I mentioned on the last slide, that 2009, that 100 billion figure was put on the table. In 2015, the Paris Agreement, the 100 billion figure from global north to global south was agreed. This graph, this slides very clearly show that until 2023, 2022, the 100 billion per year goal was not met. It was only 2022 when the OECD reported that 115 billion US dollars have been mobilized from global north to global south, from developed countries to developing countries. And you know, the rightly so, the global south and the developing countries had been very much complaining about the unmet promises from global north on the climate finance goal. So this is just to update you where we had got these lessons. Another interesting thing which came to our sort of focus was, and this report is again Climate Policy and Center for Science and Environment Analysis in India, is that even the 100 billion goal which was met in 2022 or 2023, most of that 100 billion climate finance was largely loan. Uh, uh, Over two-third, I mean, two-third is a big kitty. Around 66% of that 100 billion was provided in terms of loan, which means that you are giving climate finance money in terms of as a reparations for the GHG emissions which have been already emitted by you, by your economy, and then you are making profit out of it. A very small or minuscule proportion of that 100 billion goal could be really attributed as grants, as climate finance. Some estimates says it's only 5%. Some estimates says it's around 15 to 20%. So figures vary, but it's definitely less than 20%, which is again a real point of contention, which was discussed in COP29 in Baku, that you cannot use climate finance or the climate finance goal to increase the debt burden on global south. So these are again the figures which were commitments are inadequate, and there needs to be a greater transparency and accountability in global north. And these are the Climate Finance Shadow Report 2023 was one of the path-breaking report which said that the reported value of climate finance mobilized in 2020 was 83 billion. The real value in terms of grants is only 21 to 24.5 billion, and it's only a quarter of the climate finance. So it's really it's not meeting up the demand, and it's also increasing the debt burden in global south. The next apart from what is happening in terms of what is happening at international climate finance negotiations, this slide clearly shows that I am personally from South Asia, I'm from India. There would be most of the participants from on this call would be from Asia and Pacific. You could very visibly see on the chart that the long-term loss in real GDP terms till 2050. You can very easily see Bangladesh, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. These are countries which are going to incur most of the loss in terms of real terms of GDP, more than 4% by 2050 due to climate change. And besides that, besides being the most vulnerable countries and most affected by climate change, I'll really like to give specific examples of countries like Pakistan and Sri Lanka, which fall in South Asia. In 2022, the floods in Pakistan caused an economic loss of around 4.8, around 5%, one flood in a country, and it costed around 5% loss of their GDP. And besides that, the debt, IMF debt on Pakistan is around 25 billion US dollar, which is huge. Similarly, in Sri Lanka's case, it has to repay a debt of 6 billion in foreign debt every year, which amounts to over 10% of its gross domestic product every year. So this tells the real story. At one end, we are going to uh, get hurt. Our GDP in real terms is going to get hurt due to climate change. And the second hit that most of the global southern countries are taking is due to the debt crisis, which is being, again multiplied by the climate finance mobilization done in a wrong way. So both the debt and the unmet expectations and the quality of finance which had been delivered on climate finance was which shaped the agenda for COP29 negotiations in Baku. And the larger objective was to, not only have it deliver or achieve a climate finance goal, which certainly, something not in billions, but certainly land up in trillions. But also, to achieve a larger financial transformation. And financial transformation, which is based on the fact that there should be international financial reforms. There should be no new debt creating mechanisms. It should be done in a way that most of the climate finance, which is going to be agreed in grant making terms. And then, if you give the right set of climate finance, then a new and ambitious set of mitigating NDCs could be submitted in 2025 by most of the global southern countries. I hope the pace of the presentation is okay, and I'm not sure whether I am able to, because a few times my internet is showing slow connection. Is it okay if I switch off my video for a moment?
It's okay. It's okay.
Perfect. Thank you. So yeah, as I was mentioning, that the expectation for COP29 Baku, which happened in November last year, was to set the stage and set the ground for achieving a fair, inclusive, and decentralized national commitments that could achieve 1.5-degree goal of Paris Agreement. And this also included the climate finance goal. This also included the overall global climate finance reform and the change of international finance architecture. And also, last but not the least, is to set one set of rule for everyone. When I say one set of rule for everyone, I mean you can't cherry pick through climate negotiations. Yeah, if fossil fuel phase out has to happen, it has to happen for everyone. The global, what we have seen in climate negotiations, and this is based on experience, is that there is cherry picking in the which fuels you burn. So people are more critical of burning coal compared to gas. They say coal is more polluting compared to gas or oil. If fossil fuel has to be phased out, then it has to be irrespective of which kind of fuel. So if you have to phase out coal, you also have to phase out oil and gas. So these were some of the expectations in layman terms, which was set by civil society. And when they went to COP29, what really was delivered at COP29 was uh, was a joke. And when I say it was a joke, I literally, quoting, I'm quoting some of the negotiators from African Union. And as you can see on the slides, there's a picture from the head of delegation and the Indian negotiator from Ministry of Finance, which said that the COP29 negotiation is an optical illusion. It's not going to deliver anything new and additional. And there were similar, critical voices which were sort of voiced at the closing plenary of COP29. But nonetheless, legally, the COP29 outcomes had been accepted. And what it really, what really has been accepted are the following. So first on finance, I mentioned about the fact that quantity of finance. I said that in COP28, the previous COP, an expectation was set for trillions. I mentioned the figure 5.8 to 5.9 trillion. Based on set on those expectations of trillions of dollar will be mobilized, the civil society demanded that there should be a mobilization of at least 1 trillion US dollar per year from global north to global south, and mostly in grant making terms or equivalent to grant making. But what had been really achieved is 300 billion US dollar per year, which is the saddest part is that this is also not in grant making terms. This 300 billion is also from a variety of sources. That also includes the contribution which has been made or already been made by the multilateral development banks, Asian Development Bank, World Bank, various international financial institutions. So in real terms, the burden from global north and developed countries from based on COP29 outcome have been shifted from developed countries to multilateral development banks. And you would know China, India, and most of the emerging economies are also contributors to multilateral development banks. So basically, everyone is paying, and there is a lack of transparency. No one knows how this 300 billion figure is going to be achieved. The next let down, and you can see the highlighted part of the text, is that the quality of finance, as I said, that the burden has been shifted. It's not new and additional. The burden has been shifted from developed countries to multilateral development bank. The text does not also clearly mention that who is um, going to be the main responsible person. So if the 300 billion has to be achieved, what percentage of 300 billion is going to be paid by US? What percentage of the 300 billion kitty is going to be shared by EU? And within EU, what percentage, how the bifurcation of those targets have to be done? So no burden sharing has been mentioned. The third failure for COP29 in terms of finance were the time frames. The civil society expectation was that the 1 trillion goal should was to be met till 2030. The COP29 outcome mentions that it will be met by 2035, which is 11 years down the line. We are in 2025 now. Now it's 10 years down the line, but 10 and 11 years doesn't make a big difference. But it's a decade long sort of a legal process that we are stuck in, and we don't have time. If we need to do some climate action, we need money, we need finance, and the mobilization of money to invest in low carbon infrastructure has to be done real quickly. The fourth and the biggest factor was, and this was a demand from developed countries, that based on the economic realities of 2024, some emerging economies, especially China, should be part of the contributor base. So they said that the contributor base should also include some emerging economies along with the historical polluters. But as I said, now it's not one country, it is the multilateral development banks and all other sources of voluntary contributions. Certainly, it includes the developed countries, it includes various other means of finance mobilization, but the language is so unclear that it includes anything and everything. Last but not the least, apart from the expectation from finance from COP29, the expectation was also on mitigation work program. Mitigation work program, if you know, and just to give you a brief background, was agreed in 2021 in the UK COP, and this was agreed to really ratchet up the action and ambition on mitigation. Mitigation, as you see, is largely done by renewable energy, by increasing energy efficiency, by reducing the GHG emission, trajectory from most of the high emitting countries or the overall global GHG emission inventory. Nothing has been achieved this year under the mitigation work program. Though last year the global dialogue under the mitigation work program was uh, uh, based on the central theme of cities and urbanization. Climate Action Network South Asia, Miserior, and the South Asian platform did also some very handsome submissions on what are the ideas or what are the overall areas where mitigation work program could play a very robust role in reducing the overall GHG emission trajectory by 2030, but nothing really moved on mitigation work program. Basically, it also was sacrificed due to the global geopolitics. So global north, largely the developed countries, did not budge on finance, and the developing countries led by Saudi Arabia, China, and India did not budge on mitigation work program. They blocked all negotiations related to mitigation work program. Last but not the least is of course the discussion under the third important agenda item, which was the global goal on adaptation. Apart from mitigation finance, adaptation reasonably is the third and most important pillar in climate negotiations. Were not discouraging, but this agenda item was stuck because of the fact that the technical aspects of getting a set of indicators agreed under the GGA is a very tedious task. So we hope that the adaptation agenda will pick up in the next few months, and some hooks are there till June 2025, and we'll keep everyone posted once we know more on adaptation, but nothing in terms of real tangible outcome of adaptation. So just not to push it too much, I think basically what I wanted to mention through these last 20-25 minutes of my presentation is that it's really important to understand and contextualize climate reality in 2025, so to set the stage and expectation from the start of this year, and what we could meaningfully achieve by the end of this year. Is first is that both developed and developing world NDCs are highly insufficient to keep the world in safe temperature limit in line with Paris ambition. Unfair climate burden is being passed on small, vulnerable, and island states, the SIDS, the LDCs, countries in my region, in various other parts of the global south, Bhutan, Colombia. So many countries are facing the dire death due to climate change when they have nothing to do with it, when they are even positive. Countries like Bhutan are climate positive. They have no total climate emissions, but they are also facing the burns of climate change. They are facing the burns due to high levels of glacial melt. It's a Himalayan state. So I think small island states and LDCs have to do more than their fair share, which is really unfair and unjust. Last but not the least is developed and developing countries, also including emerging economies, are pointing towards each other. And the emergence of China as largest GHG emitters, along with a growing emissions from India, has given a window of opportunity to develop countries to dump differentiation thoroughly. So what is happening is that developed countries is just and we have seen it in the last decade of climate negotiation, is that the dialogue around differentiation, common but differentiated responsibility, is been diluted in the last decade or so, in the pretext that countries like China and India are now economically stronger, and they should be doing more. That does not mean that differentiation can be diluted for other LDCs and SIDS. Similarly, the failure of developed countries to meet climate finance goal, 100 billion goal, is being used as a counter argument by developing countries to limit their national climate ambition below the respective fair share. So that's the reality where we are coming, and we are starting 2025, and let's see what we could meaningfully achieve. And I'll use the example of India, and we've set the tone, I think, when we are in a situation where there is excessive debt burden, there will be increasing impacts. We have seen impacts of climate change, not only on human health, not only on our well-being, but also on national GDP. The policymakers will have a far reduced fiscal space to make new commitments vis-a-vis the national determined contributions, vis-a-vis the national adaptation plans, or any other low carbon infrastructure priority, so to say. So I think the expectation after COP29 outcome, and especially it will have its implications on the revised set of NDCs, has to be toned down. Um, so specifically, if I can say a few things for India, is that there were discussion before COP29 that would it be possible for a country of India, of a stature and energy requirement like India, to commit to no new unabated coal power plant after 2035? I don't think so. That's going to come after the climate finance deal, the bad deal that we've landed. The second conversation was a complete phase out of internal combustion engines in case of India. This is an ongoing discussion. I think this is something which is going to be reported in India's national NDCs. Energy efficiency targets, 30% sub targets for various critical sectors like steel, cement, fertilizers, and new energy needs from green hydrogen, innovative sources of energy generations are going to be also reflected in the NDCs for India. So this is just to give you an examples, how implications of international negotiations will be reflecting on NDCs. I'll not go into details of all of this conversation which is happening in my backyard, but not to digress too much from topic, I think I can move quickly on the last bit of section on urbanization, if that's okay. Uh, Zaki, if you can confirm how much time do I have, and in what time do I need to wrap up?
Uh, it's about 10 minutes more. Maybe you could speed up.
Perfect. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
I'll cover up in 10 minutes. So
Yep.
I think I've
Okay.
thank you, Zaki. I think I've wrapped up too much. I think global climate politics, COP negotiations from COP28, what happened in Dubai, what happened in COP29 in Baku, how the expectations were set, how the expectations were unmet. And in all of this international climate negotiations, where does urbanization factor? Where does cities factor? So it's really important to understand why we are talking about the urban climate finance things. And I think the chart on the screen shows you. So these are two in every region. If you can see on this screen, uh, in every region there are two skyscrapers. And for example, in South Asia, in Central Asia, in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, and what these skyscrapers denote is that one skyscraper is for 2030, another is for 2050. The red color in the skyscraper denotes the loss of life due to heat stress. You can visibly see that the implication of climate change on human health and well-being, especially in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, in East Asia, you can see the visible difference between the red lines between 2030 and 2050. So I need not say more. And these are the regions, these are the global southern regions. You can also see and compare it with the US, the Northern American countries, Europe for an example, and compare these both the 2030 and 2050 skyscraper, compare it with Africa, with Asia. And you'll get a clear picture. Certainly, the number of deaths from heat stress are going to multiply by three folds or four folds or five folds in most of the global south countries. Where is it happening? Certainly, it's happening in our backyard. When we say in our backyard, this is global south. And this slide shows the 2030 percentage of urban and urban the cities which are not particularly smart cities or real city size, but mostly urban centers. And you can see from this chart is that most of the red dots show cities with population with over 10 million. The gray dots show cities with population from 5 to 10 million, and the blue dots show cities with population from 1 to 5 million. Most of the blue, reds, and gray dots are in China, in India, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and in Central Asia. Uh, so, and you can see that how why most of these deaths, which the loss of the loss of human life from climate change will happen in global south, because our cities are getting overburdened. Our urbanization is getting messy, and it's getting unmanageable. There is high rate of migration in urban areas. Again, I'll quote some examples, is that the slum population is over 17% in most of that's the average in most of the urban cities in India. And it's even more in the city that I live, Delhi. 22% is the slum population of the overall size of Delhi. So it's huge. Number of people are living in informality, in conditions which are not right to live. So that's another good way to depict that urbanization, poverty, and challenges of growth is something which is really important for us to factor in this point of time, to not only tackle climate change at negotiations level, but also at our regional level. Why is it happening in our backyard? Because we've seen, and why is it happening more prominently now, is because we have seen in the last 5 years both poverty, pandemic, and informality increase. Again, by couple of charts you can see is that the gray the what should I say? I'm not really good in colors. Is that the gray chart denotes South Asia, and the real blue chart denotes sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see the pre-COVID period and the post-COVID period. In South Asia, 49 million people were below poverty line. After COVID, 56 million people. So 9 million additional people were pushed into poverty line, less than 1.9 US dollar per day, due to the side effects of COVID and conflict and pandemic, hitting, and undoing all the gains in poverty eradication in the last one generation. And this is just followed up by what really happened in Africa. 26 million people were there in pre-COVID period, and then it was there in post-COVID period, turned out to be 40 million people. Again, an example of why cities, and who are the people, the people, those who live in informality, the people those who do not have a right to reside in cities, the people who lives on footpaths, under the flyover bridges, near railway stations, and slums. You can see the case of Delhi. One man washing his face from water, and this is peak summer season. Last year, Delhi recorded a temperature of 52.9 degrees Celsius. And this was the extreme heat that we have to face first time in even my life experience. The second figure is the time that we are living in now. This is peak winter season in Delhi. The air pollution AQI levels in Delhi, the temperature levels is shivering. We are around 4 to 5 degrees Celsius minimum. So most of the people have to burn a bonfire to keep themselves warm. And then the air pollution level is more than 400 AQI. That's average. I also mentioned that at the initial part of the presentation, that 2024 was the year when the 1.5 degree goal has already been breached. This slide shows very clearly, this is the IPCC graph. It shows that between August to March 2024, the 1.5 degree target has already been breached, and we are well below 1.5 degree world. So what do we do, to tackle climate change, not only at international level, but also regionally and domestically? And this slide certainly, um, uh, puts things in perspective. What are the challenges and what are the solutions? And I need not go into the detail. The figures and the pictures says a lot. We certainly know that the rapid and often unplanned urbanization has sort of overwhelm our not only the cities but all the ecosystems. You can see in the picture there are skyscrapers, then there are slums, and then there is a river which is filled with dirt and filth. What we need to do is, as part of solution, is we need to promote sound urban planning with sustainable buildings, low carbon transport, and green spaces to maintain sustainable lifestyles. The second challenge is that our cities are huge energy guzzlers. They are not they are not a problem. They are part of the problem. Their net consumption of energy is over 80%. Of course, cities uh, cover less than 2 to 3% of overall land area, but they consume over 80% of energy which is consumed worldwide, and 75% of global waste and carbon emissions come from cities. So what we need to do as part of solution, we need to invest in renewable energy, waste management, and sustainable and green infrastructure. Last but not the least is that due to high concentration, we also showed you a slide where the most of the high concentrated cities are coming in South Asia, Southeast Asia, China, Central Asia. These cities are highly vulnerable to various natural calamities, landslides, disasters, earthquake, flash floods. Earthquakes certainly cannot be climate disasters, but then the higher the density, the more vulnerable people would be. We have seen so many earthquakes happening in the last 1 decade in our neighboring country, Nepal. So what we need to do is that we need to protect our cities, and we need to really invest. We really need to invest in a people-centric, a pro-poor approach. And that's where the role for civil society is. We should strive for a pro-poor and climate-inclusive urbanization. And that's where we also come from. As Climate Action Network South Asia, we not only work with grassroots organization on issues related to building resilience to impacts of climate change. We work with civil society organization as grassroots to build that advocacy. We also work with national level governments to build the CSO's capacity. And last but not the least, we are also tackling this challenge of climate politics and how informality and urbanization at large can be catered in various negotiating streams, which could be the Just Transition Program, which could be the Global Goal on Adaptation, or let's not last but not the least is the finance conversation that I just gave you a presentation about. So all three levels, multi-level approach that we are taking as civil society to tackle the problem of climate change and make it more climate inclusive urbanization. I'll not go into much more detail. I think spoken too much. I'll hand over back to you, Zaki, and I'll stop for the moment for question and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nakul, for your very informative presentation. I know participants maybe can't wait to ask you their questions. So right now is the Q&A session. If you want to type your question, just hit the Q&A box first. Or if you want to ask directly to Nakul, you could raise your hand through the emoji box. So to change a bit, I will firstly let someone who want to ask directly to ask the question. So you could just raise your hand if you want to ask the question directly. Okay, so Gaya Zoom 3, raise hand. Tolong Mit.
Yeah.
Udah. Okay.
So, hi Nakul. Thank you for your presentation. It's amazing. I'm Yobel. I'm part of Gaia. We're also part of CAN. And then I was there in the COP29. Well, it's quite bleak, the results, but also there seems to be some hope as well to mobilize forward. And regarding your presentation, I want to understand what's your reading on the results of this climate finance ambitions in context of the indices, because as we know in indices there's conditionalities, right? Like CM1, CM2, with international support and without international support. And now with the ambitions below trillions, what does it mean for developing countries that are working on their indices now to be submitted maybe in February, maybe later? Will this hinder ambitions? And then as CAN, what are the strategies, or how do we navigate this situation to get the best out of it? Thank you, Nakul.
Thank you, Gaya, and thanks for joining the conversation. I completely agree, and that's a really pertinent question. And I think, and honestly speaking, I think I don't have the exact answers. I wish I could have the exact answers to the queries, and I could see through the crystal ball what is going to happen. But certainly, what I can tell you is that the overall conversation, what we have seen in Global South, and especially in my part of the region, is that since I am from India, and India was one of the countries which protested very vocally and was at the forefront of leading the pack, which protested against the acceptance of COP29 outcome on climate finance. What we read is that that was a political call, and it was really to indicate that if you have dumped finance, will not mince our words. We will be taking really hard stances on NDCs and commitments on climate actions via the UNFCCC NDC system. That's one thing to say. So the ambition under the UNFCCC NDC system, especially from India, and not only from India, from most of the southern states in South Asia, is going to be taking a downward sphere. But that does not necessarily mean that domestic actions won't be happening. When I say domestic actions won't be happening, you can certainly, I can watch out for a case for the fact that uh, for a country like India, renewable energy is something which is very clearly investable option. So the targets around renewable energy, for targets around energy efficiency, which makes an investment case, are not going to be reduced. Whether or not a country of like India or any other country, so to say, would submit those targets as part of UNFCCC system is something that we are going to see in the next few months. In terms of timelines, most of the NDC submissions are not going to happen from South Asia perspective by end of February. They are going to, and the anticipated timelines would be somewhere around June for countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan. And for India, it could be around November and October, but certainly the NDCs are going to be revised. Last but not the least, is the can take is that we are going to, again, increase the pressure on getting a fair and inclusive climate finance system reforms. Certainly, under the UNFCCC system, we have lost a fight at COP29, but there are other avenues. There are other avenues related to the G20. There are other avenues related to the multilateral development banks, the annuals, World Bank annuals, where the fight to remap the international financial architecture, to reduce the cost of finance, and to get another areas where something could be managed so that the ambition or the NDC's trajectory, the mitigation versus finance thing does not become so obvious that the overall loser would be the climate ambition. So I hope I'm being able to answer your question on where does CAN strategy stands on it. This is the start of the year. This strategy is subject to evolve, but that's the anticipated trajectory that we are going to take in the next few months.
Thank you, Nakul.
Okay. Another questions, maybe direct questions. If participants want to ask direct questions. If not, then we can shift to the Q&A box, Nakul. So there's already around 4 questions. Maybe if you want to address each of the questions.
Thanks, Zaki. I think we've already taken up the question from Gaya, and I think the second question is from Karinua. It's about how things that hinder cities to access climate funding are bureaucratic process with regards to Sophia's presentation. Is there any specific actions that are being taken at COP29 to simplify the complex bureaucracy? I think this is both presentations. Karinua is asking questions about both presentations related to climate change and finance availability for cities. What made me think is that about carbon trading. But on the other hand, I think that it is just merely shifting responsibility without addressing the root cause of climate change. What do you all think? I think, Karinua, I think I'm not an expert, certainly on the project or the finance mobilization for cities or carbon trading as well. I mostly follow climate process, but I would partially agree with you on the carbon trading thing. Yes and no. Yes, because carbon trading is something. See, the finance question is very important. If you're not getting, and we throughout my presentation, I've said a couple of times that Global North has not delivered on its promises of 100 billion, and the climate finance goal has not been mobilized. But we should not be, ignorant of the fact that things are very difficult in global northern countries, in Europe in particular, with COVID, and then the conflict is stretching up, and it's eating up the budget of most of the global northern and European countries. So at that point of time, carbon trading is something which gives you the oxygen mask to do some sort of action related to some sectors. Certainly, there are apprehensions about carbon trading that it should be happening in a transparent manner. It should not be done in a way that it becomes a case for exploiting ecosystem services, water, forest, so many things. And it should not be, something which cannot be monitored properly. So both things, yes and no, that's where the monitoring and transparency aspects of carbon trading must be very tightly monitored. And that's where the apprehensions of COP29 outcome were also there for civil society when Article 2.6.2 and 6.4 decisions were agreed in COP29. So both yes and no on your question. On issues related to funding for cities to access climate funding, it's a long-term demand, Karinu. I think access modalities, not only from the international negotiations perspective, but from uh, funds that are already working or operational, GCF, the National Adaptation Plan, the climate funds, international climate funds. The access modalities is that most of these funds give money to national governments, and then these national governments disperse these funds to subnational governments, and so then from subnational government, these funds get dispersed to civil society or to other city level, initiatives. So it not only increases the time for the disbursement of funds, it also increases the cost. And it's not just based, approach. So what we have demanded throughout as civil society position is that there should be a mechanism where where the people or the communities, it could be the local people or it could be the city level government system that could access these funds directly. So I think the Zaki, I think if I'm not able to respond to this question of Karinua properly, you can also send it to the earlier presentator for getting her remarks. I'm going to take a question from Sena now. What do you foresee are the most critical topics to address at next COP? Hopefully, are you about how hopeful are you about the upcoming COP in Brazil, given the significant and the global role? No, I think as I said, that we follow international processes and we follow climate negotiations and diplomacy. It's a art of remaining hopeful and conveying your messages in a way which can be can showcase a win-win situation for both individuals, all parties, and all countries involved. So we are really hopeful that something or other thing could be achieved in Brazil. How it will be done, what are the hooks, what are the areas that we are going to focus is something which we are going to deliberate in the next 1 month or so, and then I'll be able to let you know. But I think, as I said in response to the first question from Gaia, is that financial system reforms, World Bank financial system reforms, G20, and higher role for G20 in facilitating these reforms and putting pressure on UNFCCC systems is something that we are anticipating and we are targeting to do in the next few months. There's a question from Elmot. Thank you, Elmot. Thank you, Sophie and Nakul, for the amazing sharing. Want to ask question regarding building sector, which has huge emission jump from 21 to 37. Global emission, India, China, other Asian countries are biggest emitter. How will this sector be considered in upcoming NDCs? In climate finance, what are your suggestions? This would be important regarding thermal comfort example. I think you've hit, thank you, Elmut, for your question. I think you've hit the nail on its head. It's really, really important. There have been various, and I cannot, re-emphasize the fact how important the building sector is, not only from the material use perspective, but also from end use perspective. It's not only, what kind of material that you use that generate GHG emissions, the bricks, the cement, and how can you transition from bricks, cements to locally build low carbon materials. But also once you use these high carbon materials, the thermal efficiency of these homes reduces, it falls like anything. The air condition load of these buildings, which are made from iron, from cement, from bricks, which are made by the technology which is prevalent, is huge compared to local built houses. So how can we make that transition something that we need to find out together? I don't have ready-made answer, sorry, for this sector. But it's going to be a really important sector for NDCs. And I think apart from NDCs, I think this sector will be covered in national adaptation plans also. It's also covered, Elmut, I would suggest, and especially for India's case, it's also the targets for the building sectors are also covered in the long-term strategy for climate action, particularly in case for India. But I can let you know the real exact answer, how India is anticipating to cater this sector into its upcoming NDCs. So I hope I am able to cater to all the questions. Zaki, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Right now it's already 7:24 here in Jakarta, and honestly, I think it's already passed over our schedule. But that's okay. I think it shows how the participants are very enthusiastic with this first class. And with Nakul's answer, we've come to the end of the class, the first session. Hope the participants could learn something from today's valuable class. Although, as Nakul said, learning climate finance could left us to be remaining hopeful. And I hope this session serves as a guiding way for the participants to approach the upcoming sessions, to at least have a sense of grip that the organizer, hopes the participant could learn and get something out of climate finance to achieve just and equitable climate finance and make it accessible, particularly for marginalized communities. So once again, thank you, Nakul, for the insightful presentation. To our participants, thank you for your active engagement today. We hope you found this first session informative and thought-provoking. And our next session on innovative financing and economic impacts will be held on January 27th at around the same time, which is 5 p.m. Indonesian time. And we'll be exploring exciting topics, although more technicals, like various green financial instruments and mechanisms. So also, the recording of this class and today's materials will be shared with you after the session. See you. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you, Zaki. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.